Good afternoon, and welcome to the Glass Recycling Coalition's webinar, Glass Recycling Solutions and the Role of Fiberglass as an End Market. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Marissa Segundo, and I'm with Resource Recycling Systems. We are the managing consultancy for the Glass Recycling Coalition, and happy to have you all on the call today. And in a moment, I'll introduce our first speaker, but I thought it would be helpful for a couple of housekeeping items. Each of you has a control panel on the side of your screen. It's actually represented by a little orange arrow. If you'd like to ask questions throughout the presentation, click that little orange arrow and expand your control box and type your questions in throughout the presentation. We'd like to hear from you, but you will note that you have been muted. So at the end of the presentation, we'll get to all of your questions for each panelist, and we encourage you to write those in on that panel. We'll also have a recording of this session available on our website, glassrecycles.org, in the webinar section. So glassrecycles.org/webinars. You can find this presentation and our past webinars on glass recycling solutions. So we're pleased to be joined today by three of our panelists that are also Glass Recycling Coalition members. Stephanie Johnston from Heineken USA, Scott Miller with Knopf Academy, and Angus Crane with the National Association of Insulation Manufacturers. And now I'd like to pass the mic over to Stephanie Johnston, who will start us off.
Great, thank you, Marissa, and welcome everybody. I'll just spend a moment introducing myself. So as Marissa said, my name is Stephanie Johnston. I'm a member of the team at Heineken USA, and I've been with the team for about a year at Heineken. And so I'm a recent personal addition to the Glass Recycling Coalition membership, and you might be able to tell from my accent that I'm originally from the UK. I have a background in in communications, which evolved into sustainability communications and later sustainability through my career. So delighted to be here as a panelist today, and please bear with me because I do have a cold, so if I have to go on mute to cough, apologies in advance. So I'm just going to start the discussion today by giving you a little bit of background about the Glass Recycling Coalition and the membership, as well as some insights that we have as an organisation into glass recycling here in the US. And at that point, I'll then hand over to the other panelists to talk in more detail about their specific perspectives. So just starting off with a little bit about the Glass Recycling Coalition for background. So the GRC was formed in April 2016 in Washington, DC. And at that point, there were some founding members, including the Glass Packaging Institute and New Belgium Brewery. And they gathered nearly 24 members in the early glass recycling chain to create this organization, which is a non-competitive coalition. And the goal is really to just make glass recycling work. So that's how it was formed in the first place. And at this point in time, there are currently over 40 companies and organizations that represent glass manufacturers and haulers and processors and MRFs and brands that use glass in their packaging, and capital investors and market users, and also advisory members. So a really good range and representation across the picture of glass recycling. In terms of the glass recovery value chain, I think it's important to say that the market demand for quality recycled glass remains strong, and the glass container and fiberglass industries purchase around 3.2 million tons of recycled glass annually and supply over 70 manufacturing plants in the US. And the members of the GRC represent all components of this glass recovery value chain, including state governments, and the GRC also has a government advisory committee in place. And the membership is really important because we're able to sort of spread support and knowledge across different sectors and interests in a non-competitive setting. So that's really the value add from the membership perspective. And last year, the GRC posted a survey for the public sector, MRFs, and glass industry to address certain questions with the group, and some were industry specific, but responders weren't actually required to specify their company or their region, so it was to some extent anonymous. And the survey was promoted through a list of about 4,000 recipients, and we actually got 250 responses across MRF, public sector, and the glass industry. And we're going to repeat this survey. Actually, we're going to launch it straight after this webinar, so we'd really appreciate participation in that as well. And I'm just going to take you through some results of that survey data so you have a sense of what we learned. So in terms of collection methods, US residents have a range of options when it comes to glass recycling. The majority of residents indicated that their community collects glass in some form of curbside, and more than half of the public sector respondents have drop-off programs that accept glass. And obviously, based on these numbers, some have both, so the numbers don't add up to 100%. And of the 250 respondents in the public sector, MRFs and the glass industry, 96% of consumers and residents expect to be able to recycle glass, and 65% of public sector respondents had concerns with glass recycling, mainly stemming from transportation barriers, lack of nearby end markets, sometimes contamination issues, and also cost effectiveness. So those were some of the kind of concerns that got raised specifically in this arena. And then in terms of preferred glass end uses that we learned, public sector respondents were effectively asked to rank their preferred end uses on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being the best and 5 being the worst. And clearly you can see from this slide that bottle to bottle was by far the winner on this. From a public sector priorities, we also asked public sector representatives what their top priorities were for recycling programs. And this was not a specific question for glass, but more in general. And I think it's important to note that resident satisfaction was right up there. And there's also the dealing with an expectation that really glass is recyclable. So that's something that we are definitely contending with. And then in terms of the glass specific challenges, I mentioned a few of these already, but end market contamination, cost effectiveness, processing, and the hauler or the MRF stopped or raising prices to accept glass. Those are the kind of real major challenges that people flagged. So I think these concerns really represent where the emphasis needs to be in problem solving. We asked people to pick the top 3, by the way. So again, this doesn't add up to 100%. And then from a MRF perspective, we had 31 MRF respondents, and I think this slide's fairly self-explanatory, but the top 5 factors were glass is sold. These are considerations that the MRFs have in mind. So transportation costs being the highest, processing systems, mix of single and dual stream there as well. But this is the top factors of where glass is sold. And then again, a fairly self-explanatory slide from the data standpoint, but I think this really just gives a picture on cleaning equipment that MRFs have specific to glass. So you can see a big spike there around NI's vacuums and blowers, etc. So this just gives us a bit of a picture about what equipment the MRFs have specifically related to glass. And then where glass is sold, this is a ranking, and most sell at least some as cullet for recycled glass containers. I think that's the sentiment that we picked up from this specific question on the MRF perspective. And then we asked the question of the respondents about who should really pay the recycling costs. And it's quite interesting that really, half of the respondents believe that this should be shared between two or more of the end markets, the packaging manufacturers, the cities, the MRFs, and the residents. So not necessarily a responsibility that sits with one or of these specific stakeholder groups. But then there were also some that felt strongly that the packaging manufacturers or the end markets should be the ones that pick up the cost. So an interesting perspective in terms of who should pay here. And in terms of the action plan for GRC, we're developing a data-rich basis of glass recycling information and tools and guidance on MRF equipment, models for both single and dual stream, drop-off and alternative collection. So really kind of pulling together best practices and providing tools for decision makers to make glass recycling work better. And we've also been building glassrecycles.org as a robust information source. And on that note, I will flag that all the details of that survey that I just went through, the top line results of, are also available on glassrecycles.org. And we've had a very large number of visitors to the site, and we've now got over 40 best practices in collection, processing, and end markets on the site. And I think this, can help to give an informed look at glass, and hopefully webinars like these will help to get the word out about the challenges. And also, we're keen to recruit glass champions in different communities as well. So hopefully we'll have some more people come forward based on webinars like this. We also participate in conferences as speakers and consult with government advisory members to gain insight on the public sector picture. And MRFs also look to the GRC for resources when they're processing glass in a mixed recycling system. So there are multiple kind of ways in which we intersect with the glass community. And specific to the website, if you visit glassrecycles.org and go visit the tools, there's a variety of resources there. So a decision-making tool, the webinars, some information on glass champions, also details on grant opportunities, and a map also of the glass infrastructure, which on the next slide just goes into a bit more detail on that. So the interactive map that we have available provides a kind of deeper picture of the glass recycling landscape in the US and the end markets that are available to help people to discover the local resources and hopefully find solutions to fit at a local level. And I think I'll give Marissa an opportunity to chip in with any questions, but mostly I wanted a call to make for you to take the time to complete the survey that we'll be releasing after the webinar. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to the next panelist, who is Angus Crane.
Stephanie, we did have one question that came in. It was regarding the percent of survey respondents that were MRFs, and that was about, I believe there were 31 MRF representatives that took the survey, but all of those details are in the larger report on the website as well. And if you are planning on taking the survey, there's a direct link on the homepage at glassrecycles.org. Just scroll down and you can take that 2018 survey. Now I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, it was 31 MRFs out of the 250 respondents, so around about 12%. Right, over to you, Angus.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Angus Crane, and I am a General Counsel with the North American Insulation Manufacturers Association. NAIMA is the trade association for fiberglass and rock and slag wool insulation manufacturers. And NAIMA is consistently promoting energy efficiency and environmental preservation through the use of insulation products, and we also are emphasize product stewardship. I want to thank GRC for this opportunity to tell the fiberglass story, and I'm going to give you some background on the importance of glass cullet in the fiberglass story. The next slide will identify essentially the basic ingredients of all fiberglass products. And you'll see that there is a range in glass cullet, and what I want to emphasize is that that percentage of glass cullet can become much higher than it is now, and the range has increased and improved over the years, and that the most important thing that we need is reliable and clean cullet, which I'm going to describe and in more detail later on. So I want to explain how NAIMA and the fiberglass industry kind of became involved with the Glass Recycling Coalition. We found that oftentimes waste management companies were beginning to complain that actually collecting glass was unprofitable, and therefore they would attempt to rewrite their contracts with local governments by demanding that glass collection be removed from the contract. And along with that negotiation, they would state or suggest that there was not a market for glass cullet. And that is why NAIMA became actively involved in setting the record straight and telling our story. And that's what this presentation is going to do today, is talk about the reliance upon glass cullet by the fiberglass industry. And so the next slide will demonstrate or talk about the recycling survey that NAIMA has been doing since 1992. And the data is collected from both U.S. and Canadian manufacturers. And this presentation is going to focus on the glass cullet that is used throughout North America. And the next slide gives us some of the details, and I'm looking at the data for 2016, and that's what I'm going to be reporting on. We are actually in the process of collecting the data for 2017, but because of the need to collect historic data, we don't start that until April of this year. So both NAIMA and in the United States and Canada use more than 2.2 billion pounds of recycled glass in 2016. And the Canadian facilities used 346 million pounds. So that's a total of 2.2 million. And then since 1992, from the very beginning when NAIMA started collecting the recycling data, that's 55 billion pounds of recycled material, recycled glass that has been diverted from the waste stream. And if you look at that, those numbers, that puts fiberglass insulation as the second largest user of glass cullet. The largest user is what we call the glass packaging industry. They make bottles and make a lot of the products that we then use as cullet. Fiberglass manufacturers are also a unique user of certain types of glass cullet that no one else can use, and that's specifically mixed bottle cullet. And that is, there's a mix of flint, amber, and green, and we're able to use that and turn it into insulation products. And in that way, we are the single source for that kind of recycling. All right, so oftentimes we're asked, are you doing this just for the publicity or the goodwill? And we explain to them that there are a lot of benefits to the industry by using glass cullet. First, raw materials such as sand and soda ash and the others that were listed at the very beginning, that use of those raw materials will be reduced. And also the energy in producing the raw materials will be decreased. And this is a very important factor. The life of a furnace, and the longer you can preserve a furnace, is an enormous financial boon to the companies. And so they're always looking for ways to increase the lifetime of a furnace. By using Cullet, you get 30% decreased melting temperatures, and therefore it is less corrosive. And when it's less corrosive, that means the refractories that are lining the furnace last longer. And there have actually been studies conducted on this, and the reports have shown that compared to 100% raw materials, using 30% glass cullet reduces silica use by 60%, soda ash by 40%, and saves 10% in energy costs. And that energy cost is talking about the energy that it takes to manufacture the product. So I want to give you an example of a very specific relationship, and our member companies and our companies are Owens Corning, Knauf Insulation, Certainteed, and Johns Manville. In Kansas City, where we have two fiberglass manufacturing plants, Owens Corning and Ripple have formed a partnership. And this is in Kansas City, they have a lot of these purple bins that you see in the photograph. And this is specifically just for glass. And so this glass that is collected in the purple container is taken directly to the Owens Corning facility in Kansas City. And so it is kind of a streamless and very clean way of using glass cullet. The next slide will show some of the specifics of that detail. And this is taken from both the Ripple and the Owens Corning website, this description. But Ripple Glass's footprint stretches across the Midwest. They've got drop-off centers in Missouri, Arkansas, Iowa, Nebraska, and obviously Kansas, which is where I'm talking about. And the Ripple Glass also recycles commercial glass from restaurants, bars, and casinos. And this recycling glass has a lot of benefits, but one of the most significant is that glass doesn't degrade as it's recycled. And so you can get, if 10% of the glass collected by Ripple Glass gets made into Boulevard bottles, and the Boulevard is a specific user of their glass, and then the other 90% travels down an alley around the corner from the Ripple Glass plant to Owens Corning, and then Owens Corning turns that and makes it into fiberglass insulation. So that's a very kind of ideal situation and scenario, and we wish that there were situations like that throughout the entire country. But this is a nice story to be able to tell. This is a photograph of a dump of a bunch of garbage, and ultimately that will be collected, cleaned up, and turned into glass cullet that will be used in the fiberglass manufacturing process. And the next slide identifies the different plant locations that we have throughout the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And these plants, the vast majority of them use glass cullet. I want to talk now in the next slide about some of the specific benefits that are derived from fiberglass insulation. One of the stories that fiberglass tells is that we are a sustainable product. It's an important message for us. And the reason I emphasize that is because this sustainability story is important to us, and it is indicative of the commitment that we have to continue the use of glass cullet. First, the insulation that we're manufacturing and producing makes buildings more energy efficient. And when insulation makes buildings cooler in the summer and warm in the winter, that's not only providing comfort to the building occupants, but it's also saving them money and lowering their utility bills. And just so you have some perspective, yes, it takes energy to make the insulation, but a typical pound of fiberglass insulation saves 12 times as much energy in its first year in place as the energy used to produce it. I want to share with you some other benefits of insulation, which are identified on the next slide. This is a very important sustainability component, and that is that when you reduce energy consumption, that also translates into a reduction of air pollutants. Therefore, the installation of insulation reduces air pollution, and that includes the criteria pollutants that are identified by EPA's Clean Air Act, and it also reduces the greenhouse gases that is so closely associated with climate change. So we have had both the Harvard University School of Public Health and Boston University conduct an extensive study on exactly how much pollution insulation reduces. And they have been able to document that the reduction of pollutions is significant, both again with criteria pollutants and greenhouse gases. And when you reduce that pollution, all of the air is much cleaner, and so therefore all the asthma and all the illnesses that are associated with air pollution, that is also reduced. And both of these studies, which are footnoted at the end of this presentation, demonstrate that there is a public health benefit from using insulation, not only for the occupant in the home, but in the reduction of the energy used to heat and cool homes and other buildings. So I'd like to go to the next slide and identify some of the challenges that we face. The supply of glass cullet is not always consistent, and it's because sometimes the glass cullet that is available to us is not actually what we would call clean cullet. It may have contaminants in it, and any kind of contaminant can wreak havoc with the manufacturing process, and so you make certain that what you're putting in is very clean cullet. Even a trace of paper or plastic labels, caps, cork, any other kind of debris is going to throw the furnace out of whack, and you're going to end up having to shut down, and it becomes very costly. So it's very important for us to have clean and pristine cullet. The other factor that we have to deal with when we introduce cullet into the manufacturing process is that it actually introduces pollutants that were not previously there, and that's specifically with NOx, chromium, and certain VOCs. This is an interesting kind of a quandary, but when we go to the regulators who are regulating NOx or some of these other pollutants, we explain to them, but for our use of recycled content, we would not have these pollutants. And so we find that the agencies are always very willing to work with us so that we have reasonable emission limits, and they help us with reducing those emissions through reasonable regulations. I'd like to go to the next slide. Other government assistance comes in when government agencies provide guidelines or mandates for recycled content. And specifically, state of California has required recycled content for our insulation products. And so we need to make certain that in California we have a steady supply of glass cullet. Also, EPA, if you're going to use insulation products in a federally funded project, If you use fiberglass insulation, they designate the percentage of recycled content that is required. And lastly, the Federal Trade Commission's Green Guides, which is something that we follow carefully, they allow an average on recycled content. In other words, because the supply is not always consistent, you're able to use a yearly average. And so when you see fiberglass companies identifying the percentage of recycled content, that is a yearly average. So I'd like to go to the next slide. So we've been asked by a number of different stakeholders to give them a clear definition as to what clean or acceptable glass cullet is. And this slide in particular provides a definition of glass cullet itself. And then the next slide identifies the actual parameters. And these are things that we need to stay away from and that we cannot have in our cullet or it doesn't work. And that's free metal, magnetic or non-magnetic, silver, tin, lead, aluminum. All of those things create significant problems with our refractories, and they can also literally destroy some of the components of a furnace. And also inorganic materials like refractories themselves, porcelain, ceramics, or high temperature glasses, they don't melt the way they're supposed to, and they create problems. Also, there are certain constituents of elements of oxide, arsenic, antimony, and chlorides that are very problematic. Those also have to be avoided. And then the organic materials, which I mentioned earlier, paper, residual food, chicken bones, things like that, polymers, styrene, any of the containers that you would get fast food in, those are problematic. And so we have to go through a process of making certain that the cullet that we use is cleaned up and these different things are eliminated. Here are kind of tolerance levels for certain things, and this is very helpful to those that are providing us with the glass to have these kind of guidelines. So the next slide, I want to just identify these are the things that we just never allow to have in. They're just kind of verboten. They're forbidden. We can't have them in the mix at all. So with the next slide, I want to kind of as just a summary of where we've been and where we're going is that we are telling this story. And this story is that there is a significant amount of glass cullet that is used in this fiberglass industry, and that we have plants throughout the United States and Canada, and that if we are given clean cullet, we can even use more. So we've been able to tell this story in various different jurisdictions. Specifically in Houston, Texas, there was an attempt to stop collecting glass. Again, the idea or notion that there wasn't a market for glass cullet was put forth. NAIMA members have 3 different manufacturing plants in the state of Texas, and so there is a real and an immediate need for glass cullet. NAIMA's comments and the comments of others were successful in stopping the city of Houston. Similarly, in the state of Georgia, there was urging of no more collection of glass cullet because there wasn't a market. And again, we've got 3 plants in the state of Georgia. We're the largest user of glass cullet in Georgia. And this was a very important educational forum because there were many who did not think of fiberglass as a user of glass cullet. Same thing with regards to city of Fayetteville, Arkansas, and in the state of California, where we've been supporting different measures that support the collection of glass cullet. Now, in Massachusetts and Iowa, we offered support for their bottle bills. We don't have plants there in either of those locations, but we have plants in the vicinity. And that when you have a bottle bill, it always assures and guarantees a much cleaner supply of glass cullet. And so we are advocates for the bottle bills because they ultimately benefit us. So in conclusion, I just want to go to this last slide, and that is that fiberglass could use a much higher recycled content if it were available. And that's largely because cullet is easier and more cost effective to melt, and that we are committed to the use of glass cullet because of the benefits identified in this presentation to the manufacturer themselves, but also because it is a key component of our sustainability story. And that sustainability story, when you save energy, reduce pollution, use recycled content, that is a story that resonates with the public and the concerned citizens of different jurisdictions, and they like that story, and it helps us in promoting ourselves. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to share this story here, references to documents or statements that I made, and then the last slide is my contact information.
Thank you, Angus. So we'll now turn it over to Scott Miller of Knauf Insulation.
Thank you, Melissa. Hello, everybody. I'm going to talk a little bit about the actual manufacturing process today of glass fiber for insulation products. I am Director of Sustainability of Knauf Insulation for North America, and we recycle a lot of glass, and it's a very important part of our business model today. Okay, so what I would like to talk about is kind of how our product is made and how much glass we use in very specific numbers, understanding the impacts of recycled glass on our processes in very specific numbers, and the unique differences between using recycled glass, for making fiberglass versus bottles. I will show you our particular specs for recycled glass from a fitness for use standpoint, and some of the things we have learned about contamination over the years. And what's the impact of just one bottle, just one long neck beer bottle? I think you'll be amazed. So the vast majority of our ingredients come by rail, certainly the inorganic portions. And this is true for most of the glass we receive as well, okay? The batch arrives in what we call the batch house, where the ingredients are offloaded into the floor, and the materials are conveyed and separated, then mixed, then weighed. Next. And that's where all the mixing takes place. Next slide, please. And that's just the automatic weighing apparatus that weighs all the ingredients together and conveys them to the melter. Okay. This is an actual conveyor. It's kind of reminiscent of an old XY plotter, where we have this, we use what are known as cold top electric melters to melt our glass. So this thing moves across this very large area, and this thing is, gosh, I don't know, 100 feet by 80 feet, probably 4 feet deep, something like that. This is where the glass cullet and the virgin materials are actually deposited on the surface. Next slide. So that's a molten glass stream that's coming from the bottom of that melter that you just saw. Next slide, please. And that glass stream drops into this thing called a fiberizer, and a fiberizer is a disc, very analogous to a pie pan, perhaps, on a shaft. And this is, go ahead and click. So you have this rotation, and the glass stream fills that spinner. And that spinner actually is under centrifugal force and proper melting temperature for the glass, it'll attenuate this fiber. There are thousands and thousands of holes in this spinner, and it makes a very nice concentric fiber. Next slide, please. So right beneath that spinner, this is an actual picture of where a binder adhesive is sprayed onto that glass veil. And this is the adhesive that holds the product together and gives it shape after it's baked. It's kind of like a glass bakery. Next slide, please. A large machine will have 9 to 12 of these fiberizer positions. It gives you an idea of the kind of immense size of a large machine. Next slide, please. This is a cooling ramp where glass with the adhesive applied is coming down a cooling ramp just prior to going in an oven to be baked and shaped. Next slide, please. And that's the oven where it's being baked and shaped. So, you know, a different R value would have a different thickness. Then the material is chopped depending on the product. You know, all products look different. It's cut to length and goes on to packaging. Easily, glass fiber is the largest ingredient in our product today. We currently are using 10 rail cars a day of recycled glass. The post-consumer is mostly, obviously, recycled beer and wine bottles, and some post-industrial as well, which is bottle and plate, including windshields from perhaps you had a windshield on your car that was replaced. That very well will find its way into our furnaces. Next slide, please. We have our environmental or recycled content validated each year by Underwriters Laboratories. We carry 2 validations, one for industrial commercial products, which is currently 77% recycled content. Next slide, please. And click again. And this is for bats and rolls that you might find in Menards or Home Depot at 62%. These are actually 2016 numbers, and they're actually a little bit higher, probably 5% higher for 2017, and that will be published in probably another month or so. Next slide, please. So, Angus mentioned, we have energy savings, and CO2 tracks right with that. And you know, at the 2 different recycled contents I showed you, around 62% and 77%, we save 20 to 27%, I think. Yeah, 27% energy in the melting process as a result of using post-consumer glass and post-industrial glass as well. Next slide, please. So this is something that I think it's really important for potential recyclers of glass to understand, and that's what we do for you. And I'm an engineer by training, and you know, economics play an important part of engineering. So I think that this is very important for you to understand. Next slide. First of all, we are colorblind, as Angus suggested. We even tolerate a little bit of blue. There's not a lot of blue glass out there, but we really don't care. We've learned that just based on the predominance of colors that make up bottles, it really has very little impact just due to the large portion of brown and the proportion of flint and green. They pretty much predominate and very little variation between batch to batch that we would receive at our plant. Next slide, please. So we kind of take, in many respects, what falls through the system. You know, obviously you want to keep glass as large as possible for separation, but many of the people that supply us actually crush the glass and rather than try to separate. The middle portion of this slide, you can see cullet from 2 different sources that we've received. One is crushed a little finer than the other, and the one that is lighter in color has been crushed more. because as glass gets finer, it loses its absence of color. Color has absolutely no impact on the finished look of our product. Next slide, please. So this is the economic portion. It's so important to understand. Once you turn on a glass process, you cannot turn it off. Our processes might run 7 to 10 years before we rebuild them, and it must be fed every day. So from an engineering standpoint and a business plan standpoint, it's almost the perfect process to put a business plan around. It's very important to understand that it's always there. It always needs to be fed, and I don't think that is fully appreciated sometimes when people start thinking about processing for our industry. Proximity is very important due to the mass of product that we receive. Rail access is absolutely important, but it's not compulsory if a recycled glass supply were nearby. But it certainly is an important part of rail delivery is an important part depending on the distance that the material has to travel. Okay, next slide. So just one bottle, and I like to talk in terms of post-consumer beer bottle, long neck beer bottles, and everybody knows that's the best way to drink beer. But for every single bottle that we melt, we save about 0.07 kilowatt hours versus using an equal amount of virgin ingredients. Because when you use virgin ingredients, you have to drive off, embodied moisture or water or carbon. In the case of bottles, that's already happened, and therefore that's why we save that energy. So 0.07 kilowatts saved is about a hair dryer for 10 minutes. If that gives you a visual. Next slide, please. And we save water. There's a huge nexus between energy supply and water, and this is a theoretical statement, but if you don't use as much energy, you don't use as much water, because water, the number one user of water in the United States is not taking showers or washing your car or watering your lawn. It's power generation by a long shot, and nothing else comes close. Second, it's about twice as big as irrigation, which is the second largest. Public water use is de minimis by comparison. So for every one bottle that we melt, we save about 0.4 of a gallon of water. Next slide, please. And we save about 1/16 of a pound of CO2 versus virgin materials. Next slide, please. So we're melting about 1 million beer bottles a day, 365 days a year. So you start multiplying those individual bottles, it kind of gives you an appreciation of the environmental good that recycling glass really does, which I don't think the consumer has any idea about this. But I've gained quite an appreciation in my job, obviously. Next slide, please. So as a result of using, this is just the post-consumer portion of our batch, we're saving 36 million kilowatt hours a year, 19 million gallons of water a year, and 82 million pounds, that's a typo, million pounds of CO2 are not being emitted out of our stacks as a result of using that recycled glass, which is just a wonderful thing. And the fact that our product is going in attics and walls and saving energy, it's a wonderful environmental story. Next slide, please. So I asked this in a lot of public conferences, and I have some other things like this, but it's just fascinating, and it's amazing, as a matter of fact. So that one bottle, if you melted all that fiber, or that bottle, and made one long fiber out of it, how many miles of fiber would it make? And I hear, oh, 1 mile, 2 miles. Sometimes somebody will say 10 miles, and everybody goes, wow, no way. And next slide, please. Well, it's actually 3,500 miles, about New York to Paris. That's what you get from recycling one bottle. That's why we invest in glass. We just couldn't do this with other materials, and we appreciate those who recycle glass for us. And next slide. So these are the hurdles, very similar to what Angus showed. We may have a little bit of difference. Total organics, 0.2% max. A lot of people think that's low, but I will tell you that we have suppliers that take a single stream where a truck is dumped in the back of the process and we get clean glass out of the other end of the process delivered to us. It happens, it's not widespread, having a MRF that can do that, but some MRFs can, and it's amazing to behold. And somebody has built a very nice business around our process, being able to do that. Next slide, please. So that concludes what I was going to say. I want you to have a cold one on us this evening. And there's my contact information if you would like to contact me and ask specific questions about our process. Thank you, Marissa.
Thank you. Well, we have about 10 minutes and we have some questions that have come in, and I'd like to take this time to thank our speakers for their time and expertise, and also open the floor up. Once again, if you would like to ask a question, just use that little orange arrow on the right-hand side of your screen to expand your control panel and type in your questions, and we will ask them to our presenters. Like I mentioned, we have about 10 minutes left. Anything we don't get to, we can send you an email. And also a reminder, glassrecycles.org if you want to take that glass recycling survey. We had a question, and I think this would go to either Scott or Angus, talking about the outlets for pre-consumer cullet, so not post-consumer bottles, or you had mentioned windshield glass, but are there other pre-consumer sources that for cullet that could go into fiberglass?
Well, certainly any plate glass, window glass works extremely well in our process. We do like to segregate it. So we want to know what is plate versus what is bottle, because we actually, it affects how we formulate. But windshields and flat glass are considered the same. Bottles are a little bit different, but we're about 50-50 right now on plate, windshields, and bottles. So we use about half and half.
And plate
and then
glass.
Marissa, I was just going to add one thing, and that is that I believe that there are certain facilities that have standing relationships with some of the flat glass or plate glass manufacturers that they get that product from them, the waste product.
Okay, great. We had a question about the potential for fiberglass insulation facilities in the Pennsylvania area, talking about the ability for MRFs to bring to sell some of their MRF glass to fiberglass or their cullet to a fiberglass entity around the Pennsylvania area.
Well, so we have.
Yeah, go ahead, Angus.
No, I'm just going to say that we at one time had a manufacturing facility in Mountaintop, Pennsylvania, and that is closed. We do have a manufacturing plant in New York, and there's also a manufacturing plant in New Jersey. And based on my conversation with Kurt Busey, I mean, some of the glass color that we get comes from other states, and so the Pennsylvania could be used in those locations.
Yes.
Scott, do you?
Yeah, well, we have a plant in Inwood, West Virginia, which is, Pennsylvania is a big state, so it really depends on where in Pennsylvania, I think. If it's near Philadelphia, obviously it's not as close to Inwood, West Virginia, but if it were in western Pennsylvania, Inwood is not that far away.
Mm-hmm. And also,
I did want to say that there generally is, just based on the trend of everything going into, single stream, there is a trend of needing, a someone to condition the glass, like a strategic material, or other companies that do that, because of the fact that the cleanliness of the glass is worse today than it used to be. So it makes it compulsory for some that are running a MRF that aren't as sophisticated, perhaps, with regard to getting the glass clean, that they would need a secondary processing. I wanted to make that clear.
Definitely. Great. We had a question here, and I think this would probably go to Angus with the amount of work that NAIMA's done in bottle bill states. We had a question about, is there a situation where glass is collected in bottle bill states and is not recycled due to the lack of processors in those areas?
I don't know the answer to that question. I think Kurt Busey would know, but
and I think that's a really good kind of a overlap for the last question. Is you can and Stephanie brought this up on her presentation, that the GRC has a map of locations where there are fiberglass plants, where there are MRFs there, and where there are secondary beneficiators for glass recycling throughout the country. So you can, if there's a specific bottle bill state that you're interested in, you can find the resources that are available there. The Glass Recycling Coalition is a resource always to reach out for specific questions about glass recycling based on the infrastructure in your own state.
I would just chip in, Marissa, it's Steph here. I would just chip in and say that it can even go down to a more localized level than states when it comes to lack of availability of processing, because I know that, as an example, New York City, New York State being a bottle bill state, does have problems with glass regardless of the bottle bill from a processing availability standpoint. So definitely something that's even more localized than the state level sometimes.
Great, thank you. I think that wraps up most of the questions that we have. I want to again thank everyone for their time, for joining us today on this webinar. Also, a big thank you to our presenters, Angus Crane, Scott Miller, and Stephanie Johnston. We thank you for your time. There will be a recording of this webinar on our website, glassrecycles.org. You can find that recording later on this week or by the end of the week. And we encourage you to take our survey. Everyone should have gotten a link in their chat windows, but you can also find it on the homepage of glassrecycles.org. Thank you all so much for your time, and we hope you have a great afternoon.